All right, welcome back. In case you're just joining us, Ajuri Ngelale is with me right here in the studio. Is the Senior Special Assistant to the President on Public Affairs. Ajuri, welcome to the program. How are you today?
I'm doing great. It's always a privilege to be here with you.
Good. Yesterday, I did take a look at, I started the topic, the Buharinomics in 5 years. You know, I think it's in America during Clinton's election period. They'd be like, the economy is stupid. You know, because when people are voting, they are really voting about the economy.
Absolutely.
You know, when President Trump came in, he was like, economy, this, I'm going to do this, jobs, this, and he still speaks about it till tomorrow. So let's take a look at President Buhari's 5 years in office. I know you are one of his aides. Yesterday, I asked my guests, he should give me a score between 0 and 100. And what Mr. Chukwu did say, he didn't give me a score, but he said, it's not too pleasant, especially handling of economy, because that's where we are sticking.
Right.
I'm not sticking with others.
Right.
You know. But I know you're his aide. How do you think, President Boy, your boss has fared?
Well, I think the important thing for us is to appreciate what it was that President Muhammadu Buhari met when he came and how he's been able to tackle that. Because, you know, if all things started on even ground, you would now say, okay, if you're building on even ground, we can now just assess you on the basis of the structure that you've built on that foundation stone. But if you find that you have had some very unique situations to deal with, you would now maybe assess the score accordingly. Let me be very clear on what I'm talking about. As of 2015, what did we have? We had a situation where public finance was scattered. You had tens of thousands of bank accounts. So the NNPC alone had over 1,000 different bank accounts, money everywhere, no way of looking at any kind of a single window into what federal government finance actually was. You had a situation where the audit between 2010 and 2015 showed us that over $20 billion was not being remitted to the Federation account from Customs, NMASA, NPA, and other government-owned enterprises. So there was just a lot going on. Now, we have now come to a situation where President Muhammadu Buhari, when he took office, said, look, we're going to put together the implementation of the Treasury single window, bringing trillions of naira under one house, saving the nation hundreds of billions of naira in transaction fees that would have been charged on those accounts by deposit money banks. In addition to that, the president also closed the loopholes from the government-owned enterprises. There now, you see Customs from 2015 has consistently remitted more than 1 trillion naira every single year since 2015. That money wasn't being remitted before. Same thing with NPA, NMASA, JAM, and others. We have seen the FIRS, the total Nigerian taxpayer base in 2015 was only 13 million taxpayers. From 1960 to 2015, 13 was the best we could do. Now, today, as we speak, we have over 35 million taxpayers. He has almost tripled it in just 5 years. The president has brought us to a point now in the civil service, with the Presidential Initiative on Continuous Audit, we uncovered 54,000 ghost workers that were siphoning 200 billion naira every single year in fake salaries being paid to some bureaucratic fat cats. That has been cut. So from 2015 to now, we have saved 1 trillion naira just in that civil service audit. So all of these things have now been corrected. So now you have a base, a financial base upon which you can now say, what investments can we make? Now, the president said, look, we have to move aggressively to diversify into agriculture. So the president said, look, all of these things that we've been importing, and we were a consumption-based import economy. We imported even things that we could have produced locally. We were paying $3 billion every single year on rice imports, for example, wheat, toothpicks, you name it. We have now gotten to a point where our rice imports have been substituted with local production up to the tune of over 90%, which has saved our very scarce foreign exchange that we can now apply to supporting our budget, building infrastructure. So all of this has happened as a result of the president not just cutting loopholes, but taking active steps. He cut fertilizer prices in half to make agricultural production profitable. He gave seedlings out to millions of farmers, gave through the Anchor Borrower Scheme millions of small low-interest credit facilities to farmers across the country to bolster production, reconstructed 22 fertilizer blending plants, 10 rice mills. All of this has brought us to a point now where we are at the cusp of self-sufficiency. And then once you're at self-sufficiency, you can now look at how you're going to export the surplus. So we have done remarkable work in terms of actually diversifying the economy, not talking about it, but actually doing it.
Diversifying the economy, The economy has been diversified already. It's just...
In what regard?
No, if you're taking a look at the structure of the economy, 52%, I'm talking about GDP now, is services. What we're saying actually is the diversification of government's revenue.
That's what we're talking about.
Yes, which is mainly from oil.
And that's what we're talking about.
Yes, and you see, I just did an analysis earlier. Because of the OPEC plus production cut, we will be producing about 1.4 million barrels per day of oil till April 2022, and that will definitely hamper our investment. Where do you think that, or how do you think that Nigerians are feeling? Let me ask you that question about 5 years of President Buhari's administration. Because if you take, answer that, then I'll come to the next.
Okay, no, it's a first of all, what I was, the analysis I was giving is in the context of import-export flows, not in the context of GDP. Of course, we've had telecoms, we've had so many different sectors, media operating well before even 1999. So that's certainly not in question. Now, the issue now is about when it comes to public perception. There's no doubt that we have a lot of work to do. We have a ton of work to do. The key is that we have actually finally started. When you look at millions of farmers coming out to say, look, finally, we have off-taking plants. We have off-taking industries taking off these goods that for a long time were moribund. People who were doing subsistence farming before, just farming to feed, for those who don't know, are now going into agro-business, proper agro-business, making money, hiring new staff and all of that as a result of these interventions, which are only going to deepen now as we implement the agricultural mechanization deal with Brazil that we've all been talking about, $1.2 billion deal called the Green Imperative, if anybody wants to Google that. Now, aside from that, we have been able to say, look, we need to invest in our people because our people are ultimately going to be the drivers of a truly diversified export-dependent economy. MSMEs. What has this administration done for MSMEs that is different from any other administration that preceded it? The president took off the Development Bank of Nigeria with a seed fund of $1.3 billion. Since its takeoff, it has supplied over 100 billion naira to over 100,000 MSMEs. And that's just one side of it, because we know DBN is really targeted toward the kind of the small, medium scale. Yeah. But when you talk micro, you're now looking at the Bank of Industry. What did the president do? From 2016, with half the revenues, by the way, our oil revenues have consistently hovered around $50 to $60 a barrel, and sometimes, as we've seen recently, crash beneath $20 a barrel. With the limited resources, the president put in 400 billion naira into the Bank of Industry, which has been supplying low-interest loan facilities to those micro enterprises, hundreds of thousands of them. And that is completely separate from the social intervention programs, which did not exist before 2015.
But the issue is that, what is the ratio? You know, because the president did campaign on 3 pillars, anti-corruption, economy, and security, I think. You know, the question actually is, what is the quantum of people that are also assessing these loans and the processes?
Okay, so exactly. To that point, you would look at, for example, I just referenced the 15 million Nigerian beneficiaries of the social investment programs, but let's get a bit more detailed and precise.
There's across board? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, across the programs, yes. Now, but if you zero in on the programs, you're looking at the Government Enterprise and Empowerment Program. 3 million petty traders in this country that before did not have access to even bank accounts and BVNs, let alone low interest capital, because you can't go into a deposit money bank in this country and get a facility for less than, 20-something% interest. So now we gave zero interest loans to these petty traders, 3 million of them across the country, completely separate from Bank of Industry, completely separate from DBN. That's on ground. Bank of Agriculture, same thing. Hundreds of thousands of farmers were able to access low interest facilities, separate from what the CBN was doing under the Anchor Borrower Scheme. Then, in addition to all of that, you will now look at, of course, NPower, 500,000 young people being employed with various skills that they can now use to take their savings from the program and the skills from the program and the technology we gave them, many of them with iPads and other different devices, they can now use to go and start a small enterprise so that we can phase in another 500,000. All of these programs, you can say rightly that it's not yet enough, right? It doesn't cover the need that's out there. All of us can agree with that. The president would be the first to tell you that that is the case, but you have to start from somewhere. And 15 million out in 5 years with half the revenues at a time when there was nothing like this beforehand, at least certainly nothing of this scale, I think is something that's worthy of commendation. What we need to do, though, is we need to, of course, challenge the federal government to do even more, and that's what the president's committed to doing.
How about the poverty numbers in the last 5 years? The National Bureau of Statistics released poverty, the latest data for the last 1 year, from October 2018 to September 2019. Right. 82.9 million Nigerians are poor, excluding Borno State, because they couldn't survey Borno State due to obvious reasons. Also, during this period, poverty capital, Nigeria is a poverty capital. I remember in 2017, when I saw the report, I think I was the first to go on air to say, this is what the World Poverty Clock is saying, that if we do not take time, by February 2017, we will be the poverty capital of the world. But no one heard me at that point. I think it was later in the year, media took it and, oh, okay, Nigeria is still the world's poverty capital. What is the president doing to take out a lot of people out of poverty? Because I remember in his last speech, he also did say he wants to move 100 million people out of poverty. Thank you so much. There's multiple angles from which I want to address that question. It's a very important one. First of all of us would agree that one administration did not create the poverty of this country. We all know that this is something that is built over the course of decades, inaction, government fund misappropriation, maladministration over a very long period of time. I think if anybody who is dispassionate, take the SSA title out of it and just try and look at it, would acknowledge that we encountered a very serious crisis in 2015. Obviously, aside from the economic crisis and all of that and where we were financially, we knew that all of the issues with Boko Haram, the Ajuri system of education in the north, the cultural setting in which people are having, 9 children, for example, with an income of less than 5,000 naira in a month. These are cultural, socio-cultural factors that had never been addressed. The president now comes in and says, look, we have to tackle this, not just in terms of the intervention programs and making sure that we support MSMEs and farmers and all of these things. That's all fine and good. But if we don't address the socio-cultural factors of people who should not be having children, particularly at that rate, unchecked, right, that they cannot even afford to take care of their children, they end up sending the children into the streets and all of that, we have to address that problem. So the president now said, look, we have to address Ajuri education. We have to do it once and for all. So he has now rallied all of the governors together under the aegis of the National Economic Council and said, all of us, it's dependent on all of us that we assure that within the next few years, there is compulsory education, free compulsory education from 0 through 12. Nationwide in every state. A big part of the solution is dealing with the structure of the country. We all talk restructuring. But there's been free education, especially at the primary school level. No, but implementation of that. Okay. Implementation in the states is what we're talking about, making sure that it actually happens, not just by grammar. And the way that it happens is this. We always talk restructuring. People campaigned on restructuring. Even when they were in office, they did nothing about restructuring but campaigned on it. The president doesn't talk restructuring, but he has been doing it. Look at local government autonomy. Last year, a few days after being sworn in for a second time in office, what did the president do? He established and implemented the Nigerian Financial Intelligence Unit guidelines, which have seen local government accounts being replenished directly from source, from the Federation account. I can give you an example of Yola South in Adamawa that had not, from 2002 to 2019, Yola South local government, their local government account, had not recorded more than 500,000 naira in that account in 17 years, from 2002 to 2019. The first month that the NFIU guidelines were put into place by President Muhammadu Buhari against the backlash of state governors, 120 million was credited to that account in 1 month. My point is that these are some of the structural changes that the president has brought, even against the pushback by state governors. How did he follow that up? Just a few days ago, he signed into effect Presidential Executive Order number 10, which is operationalizing the constitutional amendment that took place over the last few years, where the majority of state houses of assembly, over 2/3 or more than 24 out of 36 state houses of assembly, agreed that there must be financial autonomy for state legislatures and states judiciary. Now it has been operationalized with an enforcement mechanism to ensure that we decentralize power from executives into the other branches, the legislature and the judiciary. And the president has not just said so, he has also led by example. In 2014, the federal allocation to judiciary was 68 billion naira.
68 billion naira in 2014. In 2020, it has nearly doubled to 110 billion naira. The reason why is because the president says, look, these institutions have to be able to do their work independently and they need to function to make sure they deliver justice to Nigerians.
No, the question, Ajuri, is that I know some of those things you're talking about. Of course, this is what I do every day.
Of course. No, we're informing viewers.
Yes. No, but where I'm going to actually is, why do you think that Nigerians still, or some Nigerians, still look at this administration as not doing enough? Or still look at this administration as not being for them?
Well, I think a big part of the challenge.
With all those things you're saying,
right,
do you understand?
Right.
Like,
yeah, no, it's a fair question.
The average man on the street is not.
It's a fair question.
Is not, is not being impacted. I said, well, okay, fine.
I don't think that's fair.
No. What I mean is, if you take, like right now, we go and take voice pops. We just go to the street and all of that. People still would have expected a bit more, because they're saying, okay, fine. We are expecting a bit more from President Buhari.
This is the thing.
So why do you think there's that disconnect?
Yes. So I think the issue of the question of disconnect is a legitimate issue. It's a real concern. Premium Times just did a poll, right, where 57% of the respondents said they approve of President Muhammadu Buhari's government, for example, the performance. Now, that you may take a poll from, for example, viewers on AIT may feel that, it's not 57%. Maybe they feel it's 25%, right? People have different opinions, and we respect that people have different opinions. That's why our own focus is, what are the facts? Not sentiment, not emotion, not what you think, not what you believe, not what you feel. What is it actually, right? So if we say we have done this, have you done it, or is this propaganda you're talking? Everything I say on television or radio, I make sure that I can verify it. If I say, for example, that between 2010 and 2015, the federal government of Nigeria, at the time of highest oil revenues in history of $100 per barrel, borrowed $30 billion, and that from 2015 to 2020, we have borrowed just over $20 billion with half the revenues. That is a fact that you can go and check on dmo.gov.ng. But there are people, my sister, in this country right now, that if you ask them about President Muhammadu Buhari and the debt issue, they will tell you that President Muhammadu Buhari has taken out all of the debt, that all the debt we have right now is just by loose spending by President Muhammadu Buhari. That's the perception. So my point is that there's a perception, then there's a reality. The reality is that we have brought fiscal sanity to the country. Yes, is there a lacuna in terms of communication gap? I would accept that. In fact, I would say that the fact that the president, in his wisdom, thought that we could add a bit more assistance to the communications apparatus in the country speaks to the fact that there was a recognition that indeed there is a communication gap. So it's for us now to make sure that we're engaging with our people. And, generally speaking, from the time of the military era, what was the situation? Government institutions had this habit of sending out press releases to the public, one-way communication, monologue, right? They expect people to swallow it, right? And there's no engagement at all. But then they would expect that people are going to feel like they're stakeholders in the process of governance.
Do you think that President Buhari is engaging more? Do you think,
absolutely.
Do you think your boss should engage more with Nigerians directly?
Yes, thank you very much. Great question. Let me just land my last point, which is that the reason why people like me are on TV and radio every single day, multiple stations across the country every day, is because the president said, look, we need a conversation, we need a dialogue in this country so that people know that their voices matter in terms of how policies are implemented. But to your question of the president's engagement, we have seen the president deliver 3 national addresses in the last 8 weeks or so, give or take. There's always going to be people who feel that the president doesn't go far enough when it comes to communication.
For example, yes, nothing stops the president from engaging people like us in the media. I think he did it. Even before the election, I think he engaged with some media people.
He did.
Especially now, 5 years in office, we're suffering a pandemic and all of that. Don't you think that Nigerians may perhaps that believability may come from President Buhari telling me this or telling Nigerians this?
Well, that's what, okay, so there are 2 levels to this.
And I think that's our last
okay, no
finish.
Problem. Okay, no problem.
Yeah, because I have another interview, but continue.
Okay, so what you have there is, look, aside from the 3 addresses in the last 8 weeks, you would have to look at the fact that we have put together the communications apparatus within the presidential task force that has responded to this crisis of COVID-19 in a way that I challenge any viewer to remind me of any crisis that we have encountered as a country, where you saw on a near daily basis, in live television cameras, journalists from every newspaper, every media, asking questions directly to the NCDC DG, to the Minister of Humanitarian Affairs.
But this is a novel virus, Ajuri. This is new.
My point isn't about COVID-19. My point is about crisis management. We have had recessions. We've had different things in this country that have happened. We've even had, did we not have Ebola? So my point is that during that time, you wouldn't have seen on a near daily basis these individuals out in front who are on the front line administering the policies of the president, taking questions on a live on live television and all of that. My point is that we have tried to be as transparent as possible, as interactive as possible. And if we're being honest, the Nigerian government has not always been that way. So we have seen progress in that regard. It's not always the president that has to come and speak, even though he has been doing that. It's those people who are implementing, who know the nitty-gritty X, Y, and Z of everything that is going on, that are even in the best position to say, look, these are the evolving dynamics, this is how we're responding. And I think Nigerians generally are appreciative of that. And I think that appreciation isn't always broadcast to the nation when some of our conversations on TV and radio are happening.
Okay, let me just give you 30 seconds, a final word.
My final word would be to our people to just please be patient with us. From the Siemens power deal that is being worked on, I would ask any of our viewers to just take a moment with their smartphones to Google about that, to understand how it works and to understand why it's completely different from anything we've ever attempted in the past in terms of power sector reform. We're very excited about that. We have good reason to be excited about that. When you look at what's going on in agriculture, we're going to deepen that. When you look at what's going on in terms of anti-corruption, we're going to deepen that. We've seen APC officials, even a sitting Senate Chief Whip of the APC, going through a prosecutorial process, has been imprisoned. We are going to continue to deepen everything that the president has brought into the plate, and we're asking for patience from our people. We know it's not easy out there. We know there's a lot going on. Please be patient with us. Our hearts are in the right place, and we're working every single day to give you what we promised.
Okay. Thank you, Ajuri.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. I've been speaking with Ajuri Ngelale, the Senior Special Assistant to President Muhammadu Buhari on Public Affairs. He's been speaking to us about 5 years of Buharinomics. Buharinomics. Okay, so the other part of the interview will continue to look at Buharinomics. Again, 5 years. Dr. Bongo Adi, an economist with the Lagos Business School, will give me his own perspective. I've heard from the president's perspective, so let's get to hear independently. Okay, that's Dr. Bongo there. Dr. Bongo, good morning to you. Welcome to the program. How is Lagos?
Good morning, and thanks for having me. We are doing well in Lagos.
Okay. So we can allow Ajuri go because he has other things to do. Dr. Adi, I guess you've been listening to, or you've been watching Ajuri Ngelale. Speak to me about what you think from an economic standpoint, because he's also giving us what the scorecard of President Buhari has been, at least in the last 5 years. Some of it, of course, we can verify. The Anchor Borrowers Program, DBN, disbursing monies as loans to SMEs, a lot of things. In fact, yesterday I started it on the show. But give me your own perspective.
Well, yes, I did listen to Ajuri, in the very passionate attempt he made to defend the government and then the policies of the past 5 years. Anyway, I also have listened to him talk about the Siemens and Nigeria deal that is, getting off right now. So I think he was very articulate when he was defending that Siemens deal. I think he did a very good job there. But this morning, anyway, so this is not, I'm not going to be, looking at what he said, but let's just look at the facts, because when he claimed that we've had a ramp up of revenues from customs, from the MPA, from different sources, from FIRS and all of that. So it's also nice to remind him that we still run a very deficit budget, and in the last 5 years, we've been running deficit budgets. So the deficit budget of, very huge deficit. So Of course, it's not a bad thing to run a deficit budget when you can borrow, so that's not a problem. But it's also good to remind him that if we have, because he's talked about sustainability and fiscal sustainability, so it's also nice to tell him that our budget is still in deficit, a huge deficit for that. Okay, so he talked about tax also, right? So it's also good to remind him that the bulk of the tax that we receive in Nigeria, is just 5%, which is personal income tax. CIT, corporate income tax, is still about 1% or so, which is one of the lowest in the world. Of course, I do appreciate the work that the FIRS has done over the few years, to ramp up, bring more people into the tax pool. So that is something creditable to the government. And then talking about diversifying the economy, the economy, well, in a way, you were actually telling him that the economy is diversified. Well, it depends on how you look at diversification. Yes, if when you look at primary products, basic stuff, yes, our economy produces all of those things, and then the basic structure hasn't changed from what it was even in the 1970s, even in the 1960s. So then we could talk about a more diversified economy. And when you talk about diversification of the economy, when your export profile is diversified, because that's what we are looking at in terms of diversification. How much of what you produce go out of your country? So in terms of exports. So that's when you talk about re-diversification. But unfortunately, as it is today, we are still heavily, in fact, one of the most undiversified economies in the world. Even in Africa, we're the most undiversified. If you look at what we call the ECI, the Export Complexity Index, Nigeria ranks lowest in Africa, even lower than countries like Niger and Chad. So what it means that the complexity of our production is just very minimal. So meaning that it can compete, anywhere else in the world. So we have also lamented this issue about our productivity, meltdown. So the economy is highly unproductive. So those were one of the promises, some of the promises that the government gave while coming into power in 2015. And we've waited, in futility to see those promises come to life, but unfortunately we've not seen it. So what I'm saying is the fact that the economy has not diversified, our export base, our export profile is undiversified. The bulk of what we produce here is still basic stuff. There's no complexity. There is no real productivity in the economy. So it is important for us to look at these things objectively, not in the manner of propaganda or trying to defend because we want to justify our pay. So that is not actually right to do. So it's not about rhetoric. So we have to look at it. The bulk of our revenue comes from oil. And then you're talking about the economy that is in fiscal sustainability. I mean, what about our debt problem right now? We have very huge debt problem. If you go to the debt clock, you see that right now, Google it, the debt clock, you will see that our debt is about $33 billion. So he was saying what it was. Yes, before 2015, it was single digit. It was about 8 billion. You look at that, the data is there for you to see. So the debt has been going up, and then we're beginning to worry that we're getting ourselves into a very difficult position where we damage even our capacity to borrow further. Because again, I spoke about that the last time I was on TV about the precarious situation of our debt profile right now, because the government's independent revenue, about 96% of that is used for debt servicing. So that puts us in a very dangerous position, and that has happened over the past few years. Now we have a growth problem. So we have growth problem in the economy. The economy has barely averaged 1.5% in the past 5 years. Okay, so we don't want to talk about that. The population problem is there. So we have a population that is growing at 3%, and then we have an economy that is not even able to grow half that, in a year. Okay, so that is not something to make anybody smile.
Okay, Dr. Adi, just I allowed you for like 2 or 3 minutes to speak your mind on perhaps what you think and react to what Ajuri said. In the midst of all this, 5 years of Buharinomics, are there any upsides for you? Because Ajuri actually did enumerate the upsides of this government's administration. They've done this, they've done that. Infrastructure, Lagos-Ibadan high-speed railway, Lagos, that's talking about infrastructure now. I can go into that. If we have time, we can go into that later. But are there upsides for you in all what you say, are there upsides for this government?
Well, the upside I would see, I don't know if I would attribute it to what government consciously did. Okay, because somehow when we expected the economy to really melt down completely, but we saw it, coming out of that. So I like some part of the statist policies they've implemented, because when you look at also the list of achievement that Femi Adesina released the other day, so you could see that they were all, going towards support for states, support for public sector. So kind of a statist system. So we know the disadvantages of such. But again, of course, it's not all bad, because in that sense, we could see somehow we started to reach a certain level of internal, capacity when it comes to our agriculture, especially rice, after the closure of borders. Yes, some economics, the classical economics, will argue that it's a bad thing to do. But for me, I think it makes sense for us to try to defend, sometimes protect the local industry and give them opportunities actually to grow, so that we can, step down on anti-dumping and all of that. So that is what I would say that, okay, that's been a major achievement of the government. But besides that, I think that government, since it's still in power, it's also a credit to them that they have opportunity to listen to Nigerians, to know what they have done wrong, and then they have very good opportunity to make things better, to actually fulfill their campaign promises. They have 3 good years, and it's a good opportunity for them to make things work.
Where do you think the weakest link is in this administration? Where do you think the weakest link is coming from, based on the 3 pillars that President Buhari campaigned on? Let me take it from that angle. Economy, anti-corruption, then security. Where's the weakest link?
Repeat.
Okay, Dr. Adi, did you hear me?
No, I'm just hearing you now.
Okay. Yes, I asked earlier where you think the weakest link for this administration is coming from, based on the 3 pillars that President Buhari campaigned on: anti-corruption, security, and economy. Where's the weakest link for him?
I can tell you that all the wings have been very, very weak. So I can tell you that which one is weaker than the other, because for me, 5 years down the line, we're still having insecurity issues, very serious ones, and every day it's increasing. Boko Haram menace has been there. So each day we hear that they've been stamped out, but then the next day they are conquer, take more territories and all of that. And then in addition to that, we now have the increased rampage of Fulani herdsmen, all over the country, which have disrupted our agricultural, activities in so many places, in the core, food basket region of the country, and in so many places, and they continue to terrorize, and we have not seen any sort of deliberate or consistent government response to that crisis. So that's been on. So when he talks about security, Nigerians, I can tell you that we're more insecure now in many places. Except when you live in some places in Lagos where you maybe you don't have such threats, but every other country, traveling on the road these days is a nightmare that nobody wants to undertake because of the high level of insecurity. So you talk about anti-corruption. Yes, I think it seems to have been one-sided. One-sided in the sense that we see that, if you're with the government, then you are good, but if you're not, then you will be in trouble, because we've seen that. So Dr.
Adi, hold on a bit. Ajuri actually did mention earlier the APC chieftain, the chief whip, I think, is still in prison now. So he did mention that as part of fighting anti-corruption. Yes. Okay, Dr. Adi, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay. Ajuri did mention earlier when he looked at anti-corruption, he did say that the chief whip...
I lost you again.
Oh, okay. I think...
The network has been very...
Okay. Should we take a break to fix that? Should we? Can you hear me? Okay, let's quickly take
I can hear you now, please, if you come again.
Okay, you can hear me now. Okay, what I was actually asking earlier is Ajuri did make a case that the APC chief whip is in prison right now. So would it be right to say it's one-sided?
We have to look at we are looking at 5 years, not just now. So we are looking at 5 years. So 5 years, yes. Again, the thing about corruption in Nigeria, there's lack of transparency. That's the thing. So to fight corruption, the first thing is to increase transparency. So let's look at the data, because everything is about data. Let's look at our ranking in the anti-corruption ranking at Transparency International. So where have we been in the last 5 years? So I thought, given the kind of momentum and impetus that the government came up with for corruption, I would have expected us to have been, to have moved up that rank. I mean, in terms of corruption perception lessening, but it has increased given the report that we get from Transparency International. So the last time they released their data, I think the government went after them, disputing the data, but we don't have to dispute all that because other countries don't do that. So when you have the data, then you don't need to argue.
When you have the data, you don't need to argue. Now, how do you think that this economy can survive this pandemic? Especially now we are looking at President Buhari's 5 years in office. There's a pandemic, the pain is there. I did reel out earlier oil price, what we expected to produce, oil price today, our production capacity till perhaps 2022 because of OPEC plus cuts. How do you think this administration is going to survive economically?
Okay, this administration, yes, this administration can survive if they can change track at this point in time. They have a very good opportunity to really do things better, as I said earlier. And how can they do that? If you look at the policies they've been reeling out, what they've done in the past 5 years, you notice that it's been like statist, okay? So draconian statist policies. And you know that private sector is very sensitive to such kind of things. So one thing that you haven't seen happen is where they said, okay, this is how we supported the private sector. So the private sector, Judy was also talking about productivity and all of that. I needed to tell him that the manufacturing sector is still in recession. Okay, they keep talking about the high cost of finance. Access to finance has been a big problem. So we haven't seen where the economy has become more conducive for private sector active involvement, and that is what is required, and that is the last key. In fact, the last straw that the government needs to latch onto is an opportunity for them. Now, open up the economy and let the private sector drive so many of the things. Government should just take itself out of so many things, make the conditions conducive for private sector active engagement in Nigeria. Now, we talk about capital importation. The MBS released the data the other day. So yes, Nigeria is still an attractive environment for private sector equity inflow, but we're not seeing a lot of that. Okay, so we have the population, we have all the necessary ingredients. Even when it comes to infrastructure, is it every infrastructure that government must have to do? So how do we incentivize the private sector to get into, to get involved? And that is what is left for the government to do, and that is where our redemption lies. If you can bring in, incentivize the private sector to come in and take, leading role, the commanding height of this economy, I think things will work better. I think that's what has made a difference between this administration and the previous ones. The previous administrations, okay, were a little bit open to private sector engagement, but we've seen a lot of restriction on the private space over the past 5 years.
Now, Dr. Adi, Ajuri also did mention earlier, when I asked him the question of poverty, he did say that it should not just be attributed to this administration. Do you agree with him that perhaps the poverty numbers we're seeing right now, the World Poverty Clock, our label is the world's poverty capital as it is right now? Do you agree with him or with this administration that is a culmination of years of economic decadence, of what we are supposed to have done? Dr. Adi, are you still there? Okay.
Yeah, I think I agree with Ajuri on that point. Yes, poverty that we see in Nigeria. The poverty we see in Nigeria today is truly, the accumulation of years of neglect. Now, our economy, even in the days where between 2010 or 2008 and maybe between 2002 till 1999 to 2015, when we averaged 6% growth rate. So we had growth, but we didn't have transformation of the economy. Yeah. So there was no structural transformation of the economy. So the economy was like, artificial. running on the peripheral. So there was no structure behind the growth that we registered in those years. So meaning that some people, even though we had that growth, we still had an inequality problem. So, but again, it has intensified over this period. Then we had the economic buffers that people could get easy money, so that could help people out of poverty a little bit. Now, when we talk about poverty, it's not only the headcount poverty indicator that we need to be looking at. We have to look at the other degrees. So we have there's what we call the H1, the H2, and the H3. The H2 has to do with the poverty gap. How much do you need to take an average poor man to get him to jump over the poverty line? And then there is the poverty severity. So we have to look at it when we decompose that, looking at the poverty severity. So you notice that the severity of poverty seems to have increased. So people who were, let's say, okay, those who were just below the poverty, headcount ratio, the HCR, they've fallen deeper and deeper into immiserization. And then to confirm that, if you look at the misery index is, what you compute it from inflation, from interest rate, and then the growth, so whether it's growing or not growing. So you have to subtract or add. So when you put that together, you notice that the misery index in Nigeria has increased over time. And the rate of immiserization has actually quadrupled in the past 5 years. So, and that's what made us the poverty capital of the world. So, yes, I do not blame the government for that. That has been a gradual and is a build up from the past. But again, the government, given its actions and inactions, seems to have, also contributed to the massive rate of immiserization that we witness in the country today. Okay,
final question. What economic structure would catapult the Nigerian economy to prosperity? Since President Buhari is celebrating 5 years in office, but it's during this pandemic, so it's been overtaken by this pandemic. No one is even concentrating on that. What kind of economic structure should we have right now that will catapult us to economic prosperity?
Okay, so two things. We have, we have enormous opportunity, by the way, to grow the economy. So the opportunities are still there, and Nigeria is, on a very strategically positioned to take up those opportunities. But then it depends on the political will. Okay, so when you talk about the economic structure, we have to be looking at the exports. How do we take over especially the West African and the African market? Now we have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, right? Yeah, so a lot of people are somehow skeptical about the prospects for Nigeria. But I'm telling you that it's a massive opportunity for us that we need to capitalize on, okay? But then we have to build our competitiveness locally. So private sector-led economy, targeting export-led, private sector-driven economy should take us to where we need to be. So we have practiced this statism over the years, and we see that it has not worked. The only time that many Nigerians, smiled was the time there was a little bit of that air of liberalism, and which happened up to 2015. Okay, so that was when we really, started to, signal to the rest of the world that we had the capacity, we have the capability, really, to be a world power. I mean, maybe a continental regional power. We did that because, okay, when you're saying that we don't even, we are fiscally, sustainable and all of that, I'm telling you about there was a time when the president in Nigeria built a standard reserve to about 67 billion. And that gave, it was a very powerful signal to the rest of the world. So we had all the rating agencies falling over themselves to rate Nigeria. So we had very AAA ratings here and there. So we entered so many listings that we were not. So we started to be taken seriously as an emerging economy, not just in Africa, in the world. And then, we had those acronyms. So we seem to have forgotten all these things in a very quick as well. So we had the Mint, okay, which was, we had Mexico, we have Indonesia, we have Nigeria and Turkey. Yeah. So, but today we are falling off that. So what was the economic structure that gave us that? It was a private, that incentive that the government created for private sector engagement that gave us that. But now we haven't seen that. It seems to be, it's all about rhetorics, more or less, that we keep getting.
Okay, I think, Dr. Adi, we'll leave it at that. I'll speak to you again sometime. Let's continue to watch the situation, especially as we continue to fight coronavirus pandemic in Nigeria, it's not going to be an easy one. It's not going to be an easy road for us, isn't it? What do you think? Recession for us this year?
It is not. Well, recession, we're already there anyway, but I don't think that we need to be too, well, the worst has happened anyway. So, but with the economy, as a result, tank, not necessarily.
Okay.
Not necessarily. Every economy in the world is challenged today. So what we need to do, again, like I keep saying, we have to rejig the system on which the economy is based.
Okay.
So there are so many things we need to ramp up.
Okay.
Private capital, philanthropic capital,
okay,
and all
Dr.
of that
Adi,
will help us.
Okay, Dr. Adi, I think we'll leave it at that.